Okay, this is going to be a quick overview of the American Revolution, just so that we can get a sense of cause and effect, and also continuity and change. So that one is what things stay the same throughout this period, and when do things start changing. That is a big hint for the SAC. We're going to think about what things change and how they change, and what causes and consequences are. So while you're listening, you can fill in your snake book. Sometimes I might give you other directions to do, but like I said, this will be short. So our story sort of begins with the journey to America. Remember that we're settling because South America has a lot of gold and because of imperialism. Britain wants to expand their empire. And so by 1607, we've kind of got, they're on this side actually, they've settled in Jamestown in Virginia, and then over the next couple of 100 years, we have more and more settlers come to the 13 colonies. But these colonies weren't unified. They didn't think of themselves as a country. They thought of themselves sort of as their 13 separate countries, and the only thing that they had in common was that they belonged to the British Empire. And this is the first example of where we're going to talk about change and continuity, because we're going to see, when does this change? When do the colonies start to realize that maybe they should be more unified? So we'll be looking at our study design. So we're going to quickly talk about British mercantilist policy. So a reminder that that is an economic system where the first priority of colonies is to support the mother country. So America sends raw materials and cheap labor to Britain, who pay them some money, and then Britain gives them back as manufactured goods, but America has to pay Britain. So this is good for Britain because they get cheap materials, and also they have a market who will always buy their goods. This is complicated a little bit by smuggling, where the colonists try and smuggle in products from other countries other than Britain. So Britain implements some things like the Navigation Acts, which are designed to, in 1760, which is designed to prevent the colonies from trading with other countries. They also have a policy at this time called salutary neglect, which is where they're avoiding strict enforcement of laws. And this is so that the colonies will be obedient to them. The colonists like it because it means that taxes are not enforced. So this is another example of continuity and change. This is going to change. Soon, taxes will become enforced. That's not good for the colonists because for the first time, they have to start paying money. Okay, so now we're going to look at the French and Indian War and the causes and consequences of this event. I haven't put the date in, but it lasted from 1754 to 1763. And the war was essentially Britain and France fighting for the Ohio River Valley. But it gets its name because both sides use Native Americans. And with sort of the promise that if you help us in the war, if we win, you'll get some land. So the causes of the French and Indian War, as I said, was a desire to control the Ohio River Valley. This is a valuable area because it connects to a lot of ports. So it's good for trade if you control that. And then Britain also feared that the French were encroaching on their territory, and they might even be about to spread Catholicism, their religion, throughout France. Key events or things to know about the French and Indian War is that it sent 10,000 British soldiers to the colonies. This we're going to see the impact of later. We could almost argue that this is one of the causes of the Boston Massacre, because this is sort of the first time we've got a large influx of soldiers in the colonies. Also important to note in terms of cause and consequence is that we have the Albany Congress, which is the first time the colonies all get together and discuss how they can support Britain. So here's our continuity and change. the colonies, they're meeting to decide how they would support Britain. So they're not yet talking about meeting, thinking of themselves as one country to overthrow Britain, but instead how can they share what they have in common. And then the consequences of the French and Indian War. The main consequence is that Britain is heavily in debt. They impose and sell you, so because of this debt, which is about 360 pounds, they make two decisions. They end salutary neglect, so they're actually going to enforce taxation. They also impose new taxation. So the French and Indian War is a direct cause of the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, all of those acts. Other consequences are that the colonists now have military training, and there's some increased unity. They're getting along more. There's also increased tensions between the colonists and Native Americans, and we have the Treaty of Paris, which I'll talk about in an upcoming slide. France is also bitter, and we're going to see a lot of French soldiers come and support America in the colonists in the Revolution. Okay. So the British management of the colonies is primarily sort of salutary neglect, as well as the British response to American acts. So this one will be kind of covering the whole time. But now we'll talk about the Proclamation Act. So the Proclamation Act was signed in 1763, right after the French and Indian War ended. And the purpose of this was to restrict the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains so that it would appease Native Americans. And this is largely in response to Pontiac's rebellion, which saw hundreds of colonists and British soldiers murdered as an act of protest by the Native Americans. The Proclamation Act also angered a lot of colonists, who, especially those who had fought in the war, who were now being told that they could not move where they chose, and so it was seen as a restriction on their liberty. Additionally, the Proclamation Act limited political sovereignty, the ability to make your own decisions, by giving the royal governor more power in the colonies. Remember, there was a royal governor for each different colony. Okay, so now we are up to British Tax Revenue Acts. So just a reminder, the French and Indian War leaves Britain in significant debt, which means the end of salutary neglect and the need for taxes, new taxes, so that they can gain revenue. If you would like more detail about the acts, there are other videos. This will just be a brief summary. So the first act that affected the colonists was the Sugar Act, and it's significant because, as I said, it's the first one to affect the colonists. So the cause was the significant debt from the French and Indian War, and the British Parliament decided that they would actually collect taxes and stop smuggling with the hope that they could raise revenue. So what it actually did was enforced a tax on sugar. It doesn't necessarily introduce a brand new tax or a higher tax. It actually lowered a pre-existing tax, but it enforced it, and that's the key. For the first time, colonists are having to pay. So it's an example of change from salutary neglect. It also enforces the strict punishment of suspected smugglers through the writs of assistance, which was like a warrant that gave the British permission to enter anyone's home if they were suspected of smuggling. There's one man in particular, John Hancock, and he was a big-time smuggler. He was one of the richest men in Boston, and because of his smuggling was really interrupted by the Sugar Act, and as a result of that, he became a leading member of the Sons of Liberty and would sort of pretty much pay to get anyone out of jail or to do damage. And that's because he was really frustrated by the writs of assistance. So the colonial response, like I said, it actually really only affected merchants, so it wasn't that big of an issue for the majority of colonists who were farmers. However, some people, like James Otis, who was a lawyer, noticed that this could be the start of something new and something bad. So he said famously that taxation without representation is tyranny, and he said that in response to the Sugar Act. In his letter, the rights of the colonists asserted and proved, he pledged loyalty to the British Empire and considered himself a British citizen. He just believed that the writs of assistance denied their natural rights and that they should have representation in Parliament. We're going to see this attitude change over time. This is the Currency Act. So the colonists wanted, Britain wanted the colonists to pay them in silver and gold, because the colonists started using their own currency, but obviously that's worthless in England, so they wanted them to pay with British currency. But the problem was the colonists could only get British currency when they got things from the British. They didn't just have their own supply of it, so it meant that there was a limited amount of money in the colonies. The significance of this act is basically that it limited their ability to be in charge of their own economy. Now, this is sort of the big one where we see change. So the cause of the Stamp Act is in part the French and the Indian War debt, but at the same time, we also now have an increased presence of soldiers in the colonies. It's not as much as it's going to be following the Townshend duties and even following this, but there's a significant number of soldiers in the colonies who need to get paid. So the Stamp Act was enacted and it enforced a tax on items made of paper. Now this meant that it affected everyone. So that's an example of change from the Sugar Act to this Act, is it affected everyone, so it had a wider impact. And that impact was demonstrated economically, socially, and politically. Economically, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts, and these were very successful. Ultimately, part of the reason the Stamp Act was repealed was because British businessmen were writing letter to Parliament saying that they were losing money because of these boycotts. And that is partly what inspired the Parliament to change and repeal the Act. Socially, we saw members of the Sons of Liberty, like John Hancock, who I mentioned before, were organising attacks on the homes of tax collectors and engaging in mob violence such as tarring and feathering. This is a change. This is a turning point in how Britain is the colonies are responding to the Acts, because for the first time they're acting with violence. Politically, we see the second example of colonial unity. So here, the change is the colonies start to think of themselves as one unified group, as opposed to 13 separate colonies. So that's really key and an important turning point to consider. Next, we have Patrick Henry wrote the Virginia Resolves. It's also known as the Stamp Act Resolves. It's Virginia Resolves on the study design, so I should have written that here. It's not on the study design, in most Australian things. So Patrick Henry, this is when things started to get controversial. He was fully basically inciting riots. The people who read his Virginia Resolves, or who were there in the room when it happened, they were really inspired by this to go out and cause some of that destruction that we talked about before. So unlike James Otis, who's very much, I love the king, I love England, please just give us some representation, Patrick Henry was more like, no, if they come for us, we'll come for them. So he promoted violence, and even suggested that the king could be assassinated, which at the time was considered treasonous. So this was an early example of criticism directed towards the king. Following these riots in Boston, there are more tensions, and British officials felt there needed to be more protection. So following the Stamp Act, they required additional soldiers in Boston. Now, even though this act only affected Boston, it angered all of the other colonies who feared that they could be next, because there were still soldiers in Virginia and Pennsylvania. Even though what they're doing is punishing Boston, they've put the soldiers in all of the different colonies. And this also goes against their natural rights. John Locke is very critical of a standing army, of an army who's ready and willing to go. Finally, we have the Declaratory Act, and this was passed on the same day that the Stamp Act was repealed. And it's kind of just a little way of Britain to remind them, the colonists, like, even though you won this battle, you have lost the war. We are in charge. The Declaratory Act basically said that British will always be in charge in the colonies. And it said that, explicitly, the colonies are subordinate, which means less than, and dependent upon Great Britain. They rely on Great Britain. And this was, as I said, to maintain their leadership role with the colonies and to remind them who's boss. So an example kind of would be if one of you did something silly in class, maybe you all protested and said, we don't want to do cahoots on Fridays anymore, Miss Nicholas. Stop the cahoots. And I was like really annoyed because I love the cahoots. So I'd be like, fine, we'll get rid of cahoots, but you all have to do a spelling test every Monday and remember that I'm in charge. So it's just a way to reassert their power. So this, if you were talking about it, you would bring it up as an example of, even though the colonists had a win, a victory, in that the acts they were protesting against were repealed, Britain ultimately reminded them that they were still less than British citizens. Okay, then it takes a couple of years, but but then Lord Townshend in Britain is noticing that we still have British soldiers in the colonies and we need to be paying these guys salary. And so he wants to bring in a new tax, but he also knows that the colonists might take offence to any tax that he brings in. He wants to raise £40,000. So he came up with the Townshend duties, which was, for simplicity's sake, hopefully this little thing goes away in a second, it was a tax on items of everyday use that the colonists relied on in Britain to supply. So paint, glass, paper, tea. More specifically, it was a duty on imports, but you're free to say that it was maybe a duty on items of everyday use that colonists relied on Britain to supply. And the hope was they get the majority of this money that they needed from tea. And again, they hoped that because it wasn't technically a tax, that they wouldn't get into much trouble, but the consequences were pretty significant. Again, there were significant boycotts, and the Daughters of Liberty made alternative products. Then we had John Dickinson writing Letters from a Farmer, where he said taxes are unconstitutional and would set an unfair precedent. And if they allowed the Townshend Acts to happen, that Britain could just continue to bring in more and more taxes upon the colonists. But then we also have the Big Daddy Massachusetts circular letter, and it gets its own page, because this was a letter written by Sam Adams, in which he said taxes are unconstitutional, they oppose natural rights, and he was just very critical of the lack of representation in Parliament, colonial representation. But what is key about this is that Sam Adams's letter was supported by the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly and circulated through other colonial assemblies. When Britain found out about this, they basically told all the colonial assemblies that they had to either stop supporting the letter or they would be dissolved. Massachusetts' Colonial Assembly refused to not support the letter anymore, and as a result they were dissolved, which means they no longer had a legal way to express their frustrations, to make laws, and to make taxes from the colonists for the colonies. So this led to unrest and violence, because these people have lost their only legal way of protesting, which means that there needed to be an increased presence of soldiers in the colonies, which ultimately leads to the Boston Massacre. So, if the Townshend duties had never been put into place, it's possible that there wouldn't have been a revolution, because the Townshend duties helped to create these tensions in Boston. So we're moving on now, and we're going to talk about the Boston Massacre. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Boston Massacre now. So the long-term causes of the Boston Massacre were that there was a standing army in the colonies, especially Boston, and that was in part due to the Quartering Act. Now, a problem with a standing army, especially in a town so small as Boston, is that you have a significant number of soldiers that suddenly arrive in an area that is already maybe struggling economically. So the soldiers aren't getting paid, so they start to try and get jobs that would otherwise go to colonists. So that creates tension, and we see some fights happening over the years before, but nothing quite as bad as the massacre. The short-term causes in the months before include the dissolution of the Colonial Assembly that we just talked about, as well as these tensions in Boston, but including the death of a small child who was murdered by a British loyalist just a week before. The trigger cause, though, was we had an American child throwing snowballs at a British soldier who then hit him. Following this, 300 men and women arrived at the soldier to attack, which led the army came in, and after some confusion, shots were fired and 5 people were killed, 5 American men. And the consequences were that it had a negative impact upon the relationships between Britain and the American colonists. They're already not getting along, but now the colonists can use this as propaganda to rally other colonies against Britain. We can see that in its very name, the Boston Massacre, when only 5 people died, and things like Paul Revere's engraving, which depicted it as being incredibly unfair and planned by the British. Because of these tensions, the soldiers are removed from Boston before any of them can be attacked, and the Townshend duties are eventually repealed, all except for the Act on Tea, which is left kind of like the Declaratory Act, as a symbol that Britain's still in charge. So that's a good example of continuity, where even when Britain are repealing things, they're leaving or introducing something just to remind the colonists that they are still important. So now we'll just do the Boston Tea Party and the Coercive Acts, which will be the end of this video. So the Boston Tea Party, the long-term causes were the Tea Act. So after the Townshend duties were repealed, they left a tax on tea. And then there was a British company, the East India Trading Company, who were not making enough money. They were actually about to go bankrupt. And so the Tea Act wasn't actually a tax on tea, but a way of getting this British company to have a monopoly in the colonies, which means they were given extra privileges and advantages that other people were not. That's nice of Baxter. And many American tea sellers felt that their revenue was being challenged. So they decided that they would not accept any tea from these British companies. And many colonists went and staked out the ships and refused to let them unload their tea. And this was successful in New York and Philadelphia, where the ships went back. But in Boston, Governor Hutchinson, who we'll remember was actually the man attacked following the Stamp Act protests, he refused to send the tea ship back. So, on the 16th of December, 1773, a number of men, anywhere from 30 to 150, dressed as Native Americans, symbolizing that they were more American than British, and boarded the ships. There were 3 of them, and threw all of the tea into the harbour, meaning that it was no longer usable. That ended up costing Britain the tea company, a lot of money. And so this was a turning point because it showed how the colonists were willing to do anything, even causing severe economical damage to Britain. And so the consequences were, as I said, that the colonists are now formally identifying themselves as Americans instead of British. So if we follow that sort of Albany Congress, Stamp Act Congress line, now we fully have them seen as Americans, not as British subjects. We also see a change in their protest methods. So we've got severe economic consequences. Like I just said, they were willing to do whatever. But Britain's response is just as firm, if not maybe harsher. So they passed the Coercive Acts, which were 5 acts that were aimed to punish Boston, but also punish the rest of the colonies in some ways and sent them a warning. So I've got just 3 of the acts here, but they had different impacts. So, for instance, the Boston Port Bill had a financial impact. It closed the port, meaning no ships could get in or out, meaning that Boston was not only not making money, but they weren't also able to import anything that they needed. Politically, the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly, it was decided they could no longer elect representatives, and Britain would nominate all of their leaders. Socially, they strengthened the Quartering Act, which, especially following the Boston Massacre, was seen as a big sort of rejection of those values. Sorry, I don't know what I was saying. It strengthened something that had already caused great tension in the past, in the Boston Massacre. Ultimately, the Americans' response to these acts is what led to the Revolutionary War, where they were willing to finally declare their independence. And it's important to note that in America, the acts were not called the coercive acts, but the intolerable acts. They were unbearable.